thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to Mohammed for hosting us and for everyone for coming. My paper today talks about Muslim visibility and political engagement in relation to the Orlando shootings that took place this past summer. The shooter, Omar Mateen, was identified as a Muslim, and he opened fire on an LGBTQ nightclub. This act and its Islamophobic backlash created an immediate need for new work of self-representation among Muslims to educate about Islam's relation to homosexuality. The research on how this was accomplished is mainly based on ethnographic fieldwork that I carried out in the Detroit metro area. Okay. So the position of Muslims across the world on gay rights has become a topic of increasing scholarly debate and popular interest in recent years, and well before the Orlando shootings. In North America and Europe, Muslim attitudes about same-sex desire has come to serve as one of those litmus tests that Evelyn talked about for the compatibility between Islam and democracy, or as an index for the capacity of Muslim migrants to assimilate successfully into secular societies. This can be understood as part of the larger tendency within Islamophobic discourse as the will to hunt down evidence of puritanical sexualities among Muslims and to use this as evidence of their intolerance. In today's common sense discourse about tolerance, it's assumed that as Muslims define their citizenship in North America and Europe, they should naturally embrace an attitude of support for certain kinds of gay rights and queer visibilities, both within Muslim communities and within the wider society. These expectations or demands reflect what Jasbir Puar refers to as homo-nationalism, or the state's appropriation of certain kinds of gay identities, which are then marked as normative and then used to discipline other kinds of sexual expressions, whether they be too queer or too excessively straight. Although the US and certain European nations have created the expectation that Muslims will embrace the forms of homosexuality that have been co-opted into current formulations of nationalism, the relationship between Muslim religious identity and most any other religious identity and homosexuality is complicated. It goes almost without saying that the Islamic scriptures have mainly been interpreted by religious scholars as indicating a rejection of homosexual acts, although these interpretations have been challenged in different ways. But at the same time, there are many accounts of same-sex desire as part of Muslim cultures and societies throughout different historical periods. For example, we see same-sex desire depicted in Muslim painting traditions throughout the pre-modern period, such as the Safavid painting of the Shah Abbas I. Muslim modes of understanding same-sex desire may overlap with how sexual subjectivities are constructed in mainstream North America and Europe today. However, other ways of understanding sexuality are not always commensurate with Western post-Enlightenment identity or rights-based formulations of homosexuality. These differences, this alterity, confounds the fulfillment of a linear progressive model of Muslim attitude towards gay rights, such as anticipated in liberal secular discourse. This alterity in sexual ethics may constitute a form of what Mujahid referred to as opacity. I think that was a good term. And the ways in which Muslims seek to resolve or account for this sexual opacity, as discussed below, the ways they seek to do this may represent a sprint towards legibility, but it also could represent, could have the potential to be something more promising and expansive. So today I want to look at how Muslim attitudes regarding homosexuality are coming into the public eye in urban America. Based on ethnographic evidence, I'll discuss how these attitudes are debated, get used politically, and are represented by both Muslims and non-Muslims. My goal is to show how representations of Muslim attitudes about homosexuality are used politically, sometimes to erect civilizational and community boundaries, but also sometimes to blur these boundaries. I've been conducting ethnographic fieldwork on this issue and others related to Muslim self-representation and civic engagement in Detroit since 2008. For this talk, I'll focus exclusively on a period of research I conducted in summer 2016. This piece looks at how Muslim and LGBTQ communities in Detroit publicly responded to the mass shootings in Orlando by organizing and participating in vigils. One of the most interesting things about these vigils is that participants in them sometimes use them to express opposition to homophobia and Islamophobia at the same time. Questions about Islam, homosexuality, and us-them boundaries are particularly salient ones in this age of increasing white nationalism. Studying how people find a way to respond to Islamophobia and homophobia together is an important task for understanding the potential of strategic alliance formations against groups that are stigmatized as sexual or religious or other kinds of minorities. Rather than providing any definitive model for this, I see the vigils that I studied as holding open a space of tension. This allowed room for imagining how Muslim Americans might represent LGBTQ communities in their most vulnerable moments, and in turn, how LGBTQ communities might represent American Muslims in their vulnerable moments, which are continual. Questions about Islam, yes. Building on the formulation of Roger Sanjak and Jonathan Kurtzer, I approached the Orlando vigils as what they refer to as public ritual events. In Sanjak and Kurtzer's model, public ritual events usually take place in central locations. They break the flow of ordinary life by including formal behaviors such as speeches, processions, candle lighting, and the sharing of food. Cultural anthropologists like Lori Berlant and Ann Sekovich explore the way that these events give people a way to channel emotions. Other theorists emphasize the cognitive dimensions of public ritual events as spaces in which people may think and plan as a group. These events also give people a means to organize social relations by who they include or exclude, or how they position various participants. In crafting these events, social actors create spectacles, intentionally drawing the press in hopes of changing local and national conversations. So here's a vigil that took place in Minneapolis. So this was particularly interesting because of the visibility of State Representative Ilhan Omar, Somali American state rep, and Aaron May Quaid. And Aaron May Quaid speaks from a position as a Christian activist, and Ilhan Omar speaks from a Muslim perspective. People use public ritual events to express messages of solidarity in symbolic registers, such as clasped hands. Most importantly from my work, public ritual events such as the vigil allow people to challenge boundaries between us and them, self and other, in symbolic and effectual registers. In longer versions of this work, I offer more detail on how public ritual events constitute a form of boundary work in Frederick Barth's sense of the term, but one that takes place in my analysis in an urban spatial idiom. In my work on the Detroit vigils, I lay a particular focus on boundary crossings that are articulated using the language of interfaith or interfaith activism. So now I'll move on to the vigils themselves. In the weeks following the Orlando nightclub shooting on June 12, 2016, thousands of people across the United States took part in vigils to mourn the 49 victims. In the fear and confusion following the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history, people struggled to make sense of how factors relating to the gunman's religious, racial, and sexual identities might have contributed to the bloodshed. The shooter, Omar Mateen, was a Muslim who targeted an ethnic minority LGBTQ community. There was some evidence that Mateen may have been troubled by his own non-heteroconforming sexual identity and desires. In the weeks after the tragedy, new kinds of questions, new experts, and fresh voices circulated in the public sphere. These included that of one of the nation's first openly gay imams, and those of queer American Muslims and their allies. Venues like Time Magazine, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal all cited various Muslim religious leaders to present an array of ideas about Muslim history, theology, literature, and culture pertaining to same-sex attraction. There was also an unprecedented surge of visibility among queer American Muslims, many of them young, both women and men, who wanted to represent themselves rather than be represented by polarizing political discourse. There were more than half a dozen vigils in the Detroit metro area, and Muslim Americans played a prominent role in organizing and attending them. This is not surprising given the high concentration of Muslim Americans in the area and their robust history of civic and political activism. But the first rally that I attended wasn't technically in Detroit metro area. It was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the city where I live and work, and it's a couple hours away from Metro Detroit. Soon after the shooting, an LGBTQ activist named Jay Maddock helped organize the meeting, and was the principal person who first addressed the crowd. He said in the opening speech, as gunmen strip us of our safe spaces, we will rally together as we've done for decades. And I want to make one thing very clear. This is not an excuse for Islamophobia. Islam is not our enemy. This is a time for us to come together, to call upon our allies, and to stand united in an effort to fight hate and discrimination against all races, ethnicities, and sexual orientations. At these words, Islam is not our enemy, those assembled broke into vigorous applause, prompting Jay to pause mid-speech. His statement provided an opportunity for those gathered to collectively voice their opposition to the nationwide upsurge in Islamophobia that followed the gunman's attack, which was, this Islamophobia was most notably expressed, of course, by Donald Trump, who linked the shooting to radical Islam and used it as evidence to support his then proposed Muslim ban. Across the nation, sentiments such as "don't turn homophobia into Islamophobia and war" were expressed in demonstrations, parades, and rallies, sometimes in highly emotional terms. However, these expressions of solidarity between Muslim and LGBTQ communities did not go uncontested. While some raised signs saying "no to homophobia," "no to Islamophobia," others challenged "Muslims are the problem" or "Islam hates gays." The vigils that took place in public spaces tended to feature speakers from diverse ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds who evoked a similar language to connect the Orlando mass shootings to a larger epidemic of violence against LGBTQ Americans. Often these emphasized interfaith ties forged through a commitment to progressive values, such as this vigil that took place in Southwest Detroit. The public, and this one had a Catholic priest and a Muslim American Somali community leader, the public vigils featured rainbow flags to signify LGBTQ identities of those whose lives had been lost. They featured speeches honoring the challenges that LGBTQ individuals have faced over the years and mourned the violation that had taken place, given that gay bars and clubs have been iconic forms of sanctuary spaces in the United States for LGBTQ communities over the years. In short, public vigils for Orlando were mainly about LGBTQ issues, and this was emphasized in rhetorical and visual registers by the use of particular clothes, symbols, stories, and vocabularies. Some LGBTQ attendees of the vigils emphasized how important it was for them to see religious figures of many faiths at these vigils. One person who I interviewed said that he was not religious anymore, but that it was important to him because he'd suffered from the way the Catholic religious leader that he'd grown up with had rejected him. And he said seeing other Catholic leaders at this event was a big form of legitimization for him, but then also seeing visibly Muslim and Jewish participants further strengthened his feeling that it was a healing moment for him and gave him hope. In Detroit, some queer Muslim activists and their allies that I interviewed were excited about the forms of Muslim representation at public vigils. They reported that the willingness of the Muslim community leaders, such as Asha Noor, to speak the names of Orlando victims and to mourn their losses publicly was an unprecedented show of support and recognition. But people that I interviewed were also careful to point out that these Muslim leaders at the public vigils were not Muslim religious leaders, but rather community leaders who happened to be Muslim. Some Muslim activists expressed frustration with the absence of Muslim religious leadership at the public vigils, especially when leaders from Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish congregations were a key presence. As for the recognized Muslim religious leaders, another distinct kind of vigil with its own form of rhetoric was there too. In two of the area's largest mosques, Muslim religious leaders and community members organized vigils, but were careful to bill their events as memorials for victims of all recent mass shootings and not specifically for Orlando victims, although the names of Orlando victims were recited. In these spaces, leaders addressed crowds of Muslims and non-Muslim congregants, but without the banners of rainbow flags that were such a prominent element of the publicly hosted vigils, and without emphasizing how this mass shooting was part of a longer, structurally supported history of violence against LGBTQ communities in the United States and elsewhere. As Nabil Nakawi, one of the organizers of a mosque vigil, put it in an interview to me, he said, "We consciously avoided making that central to the message we were trying to convey, because obviously there are some sensitivities in many faith traditions about what their stands are on homosexuality. We didn't want to bring any kind of opportunity for controversy, from inside or outside the community. For Nabil, the formula of mourning the victims by name but not by identity seemed to him a fair way to meet the dual goals of the gathering without risking too much. He said, these types of vigils are really twofold. One is to send a message of love and solidarity with the family of peoples who are killed, and another part is to renew our connections with ourselves as an interfaith community. And by doing that, we believe we're inoculating ourselves against detractors and attacks. At the Islamic Center of America, one of the nation's largest mosques, a vigil 8 days after the shooting was billed as an interfaith prayer service in memory of the lives lost in Charleston and Orlando. It was very close to the one-year anniversary of the Charleston shooting. Some queer Muslim Detroit Metro activists and their allies who attended this event found this model for a post-Orlando vigil unpalatable. For these activists, the Orlando victims' LGBTQ identities must be articulated to fully mourn their lives. At another Detroit mosque called the Islamic House of Wisdom, a vigil was presided over by Imam Alehi. During the height of the vigil ceremony, Imam Alehi said, "This candlelight vigil is dedicated to victims of hate from Florida to California to Paris, Pakistan, Kabul, Cairo, Beirut, Baghdad, Sana'a, Syria, and everywhere else. In no way do we accept violence on any group, including the gay community." A young Muslim woman named Salwa, who had grown up in the mosque, challenged the imam. She said, "Excuse me, I just want to be clear. Who are we lighting this vigil for?" Imam Alehi replied, "This is for all victims of hatred and violence and terrorism." Salwa contradicted and interrupted him. "No, this is about Orlando," she said. "This is why we're here. We're here for the queer people." I talked to Salwa a few weeks after the event. She said, "I think the avoidance factor there was that they said LGBTQ and also all communities that have been oppressed." And I was like, can't we just focus on one thing and not all of them? But he, the imam, took the time to explain it to me afterwards and said it was the first step. It's not anything we've done before. It's not anything that any mosque in the community has done yet. And I'm upset that we're not there, but I appreciate the fact that we're starting. Salwa had modified her disappointment, but other queer Muslims I spoke to remained unsatisfied. In response, again, to frustrations that the Muslim religious leaders did not go far enough, still others from inside and outside the community, including queer Muslims, questioned whether such demands that Muslim American religious leaders perform in specific ways at vigils to fit a progressive template forged by Christian and Jewish leaders before them might represent a disturbing kind of push towards assimilation. Some commented that Muslims have developed their own ways of accounting for LGBTQ difference other than flags, bars, and parades, and forms of publicity that are a mainstay in North American and European contexts. Some suggested that queer Muslims, their allies, and the greater Muslim community might find other ways of recognizing and accommodating same-sex desire and gender difference that do not include a public embrace of identity-based movements. Thank you. So in provisional conclusion, my work in progress on the Orlando vigils can trace some particular dynamics of continuity and change that take place within Muslim communities as they work to negotiate collective forms of identity in the public eye. Here, what can be expressed or not about the Muslim positions on LGBTQ identity is constrained by a concern not to further inflame Islamophobic discourse, and also marked by a concern to build connections with interfaith and other allies. In longer versions of this work, I'll further emphasize how vigils in general and how Detroit area vigils were sometimes represented or portrayed as a particular kind of space set apart from ordinary modes of relations, feelings, and actions. They were depicted as a place in which lines between public and private, personal and political, religious and secular were blurred to creative and energizing effect. In some narratives that I gathered, Orlando Vigil took on significance in the local imagination as a place for feeling together, in Lori Berland's sense of the term, or healing together, in the words of my informants. For some, it was also a place in which to recreate or renew either an interfaith or a civil religious public in which Muslim Americans, in their presence or absences, were now playing an important role.